This is the start of the ninth episode of Like Clockwork, a podcast of Chicago filmmakers. And it's actually kind of scary to think that we've been recording this now for over 12 hours worth of material. Um, and it's one of actually my favorite things to do every week. So I have a particularly fun conversation that I think we're going to get into. And in fact, there's a lot of news to share about Chicago filmmakers recently. One thing is that we just had the Vast Slab over last week's episode. If you caught it, Daniel Bates, founder of Vast Lab, was here with Stephanie Barber as well as Jason Livingston. And so we had an amazing conversation that went all over the place. This week, we actually have DePaul's Film Fatales, which is a student group. They're co-presenting a student meetup at Chicago Filmmakers Firehouse Cinema. That's in the Edgewater community. So if you're around, come on. We also will have more film screenings that we announce soon. We have a few press releases coming out. And of course, from now on, the big push here at Chicago Filmmakers is reeling the Chicago LGBTQ plus International Film Festival. With that being said, I am very, very excited to introduce or to have this crowd of folks introduce themselves to you. Fernando, Melissa, and Charlie were really lovely and agreed to be on such a beautiful day too. So I appreciate you giving up a little bit of this sunny weather in order to be here with us. Fernando, I'm going to have you introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll go around clockwise.
Cool. Can you hear me well? So my name is Fernando Saldivia Yañez, and I am a documentary filmmaker originally from Chile. I'm currently here in Chicago doing my MFA at the School of the Art Institute. And as a documentary filmmaker, my focus is in film portraits of labor, of communities, traditions, and how they face challenges and the current context of climate change, neoliberal policies, and just changes in general. I feel that's how I would describe myself.
Hi, I'm Melissa Yes, and I am from Alabama, and I moved back here and I work here full time now. So I'm committing to life in the South, and I'm really interested in the stories that are anchored here in this place in the South, but also the stories that kind of define Americanness for many people and aspects of our culture. My practice really started in sculpture. And as I grew into my practice and matured into it, I realized that performance and installation and video um, were becoming more prominent in my work. So, more than anything else, I'm a video artist and happy to be in the company of filmmakers. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a French Australian. I grew up in Australia and now live in Paris and have been since I was 18. And I'm a film researcher. Just recently finished my thesis about experimental contemporary photochemical film practices. And I did that at the Université Paris-Cité in Paris. And I'm actually right now in New York for the first time in my life. So I'm in the same country as you all.
New York, New York, what? All right, good to hear. New York's in the building. With that being said, as I know some of you have seen the show before, I'm going to pass this over to Fernando. You have 10 minutes on the clock. Please feel free to tell us about everything that you're passionate about.
Everything I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about many things. Like I actually I never listened to podcasts, and like when you asked me, oh, be in the podcast, I was like, sure, but what is a podcast, and like then like a topic I have to talk about. And so I started thinking, now I'm like I mentioned, I'm completing my MFA here at SAC, and as part of that, I have to I'm giving a grad talk next week, and so I mean, in this process, of like thinking, like the frameworks with, under which my practice like is developed, and it's, I mean, to me, one of the main concerns that has informed my work as a maker of portraits is this idea of developing intimacy. Developing intimacy with the people you work with, the people you're portraying, uh, in a sense of developing a type of collaboration that moves away from the dynamic subject director. You know, that's been really important for me. And yeah, um, I'm talking about this idea of collaborator in the sense that the film production, it's the film portrait production is ideally something that benefits in a way, or that speaks to the interests and concerns of the people who appear on screen. But at the same time, something to which I, as a maker, I also come with an interest that goes beyond just simply exploring a topic. Um, and uh, this is lived experience. I mean, I'm not like, it's the idea of the filmmaker dealing with a context that in a way affects them and affects their reality or the people they relate with. And I was thinking of this also in terms of films I've watched recently. I think we met at Davani's screening for the first time, I think. Davani Varillas, who was presenting the work by Los Ingrávidos. And I think this is an example of this type of approach, or at least it's the type of film that you could think in this framework, because, it's not that Davani and the work of Los Ingrávidos arrives to a place or even exists in a place just to like document and like create like an image that's devoid of, um, this type of um, this type of concerns. It is a lived experience. It's a collaboration because Davani and Los Ingrávidos, at the same time that are producing an image, are part of this reality. And it's like in like this extreme case, it's a life or death situation. We're talking about journalists that are being killed. So you can't say that Los Ingrávidos are makers that are just working a topic or a subject. They're living an experience that translates into the amazing productions they've made. Um, like this week, I was lucky enough to watch the work of Marwa Arsanios, and I think it's an example too. I mean, like these portraits of these women's cooperatives that are reclaiming the land. What's at stake in these portrayals goes beyond, the treatment of a topic, something that you could just like write up. And I respect papers, but write a paper about, and publish it and you're done is something that like requires a constant engagement. And I think when this dynamic subject director is in a way broken and develops into this more collaborative approach, it translates into films that are more truthful, to the experience and that reflect this intimacy. I go back to that word, that this intimacy that allows you to just get like something that responds in a more truthful way to what they're living, because you're also living it in a way. Um, in the case of my part of my work, I started with portraying my first film. The first film I did outside of school was a portrait of my dad, and I think that was a very good practice in the sense that he was like my family. He was something that immediately like allowed me to work this concept of intimacy, how to translate this intimacy into an artistic production. And from there, I've like just grown from like individual to communities, but always trying make portraits that are of interest and that respond to the concerns of the people that are being portrayed, and that also reflect the reality I'm living in. My thesis right now goes back to, the first time I did outside of school was with my dad. Now, after a couple of years, I'm finishing my thesis, which goes back to family, but I'm portraying my uncle and his wife, who are indigenous Mapuche, and there's this whole problematic, this whole context of land reclamation in the Mapuche territory. And again, it's like it goes beyond, to me, at least the way I feel it, it goes beyond just the extraction of a topic, but it's like, in a way, for me, reconnecting to my roots, something that is not talked about, but also how this context I come from, like these communities I come from, rather, are facing these new challenges, and to me, the way to explore that is through film. It's the language through I think I express myself better, and that with which I can like start dialogues on this, and yeah, I think to me that's, like you said, something I'm passionate about. I think that's something that I'm really thinking of right now. Yeah, I don't know if that was 10 minutes, but that's,
That's perfect. No, I think there's a lot to think about there. So thank you very much, Fernando. And I'm going to pass it off now to Melissa.
Hi, thank you again so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and almost a surprise, not just to be on the podcast, but to be making moving images at all. My journey to getting here has been unconventional. I studied biology in undergrad as a college student, and that has been tied to a long-lasting love of the natural world that still influences my work, albeit less prominently than some other things these days. But I caught a glimpse of art at some point in my career and realized that I wanted to head in that direction professionally, and really took onto sculpture pretty quickly and found myself making a lot of work that I understand better now than I did, a decade and a half ago when I started making work. Because I was responding a lot to the American landscape, specifically parts of the landscape that have been mined or abused and have changed over time. I have family in Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, and I live in Birmingham, Alabama, which is an industrial town that has a lot of mining for natural resources. I've just been very conscious of like the story that the landscape tells and that geology tells. I understand now that it was story I was interested in from the beginning. But at the time, when I first got started as an artist, I didn't see it quite so clearly. But I continued working, and I found myself making a lot of video work because the passage of time you can express it more directly in a video than you can in an object. And I started doing some odd experiments and put myself as a performer in scenes in my video work, which is a little uncomfortable, but also a really necessary step for me in my progression as an artist. Recognizing my own place in the stories that have been told before I've arrived and will continue to be told after. So I actually prepared a few clips. A lot of my work is ridiculous. Some of it's really sincere and serious, and there's always sort of an interplay between these moods. But the first that I'll show you a brief clip of is from my MFA thesis when I was a graduate student at Ohio State University. And I hope that my screen sharing won't be too clunky here. I'm going to do my very best. Okay, so this is a piece called Space Program. So I sort of reenacted a lot of the hero journeys that we see in popular culture of westward and skyward expansion, exploring into the unknown. And it's really a work of collage and performance art presented as a live performance. What you're seeing here is a sort of a facsimile of what that live performance was like.
He's got about 2 wheels on the ground. He's a big rooster tail out of all 4 wheels.
And I know it's small, but in the center screen, you see me riding a horse through the desert, just like an astronaut.
Come on back, John. And the deck is running.
And so I think so much of storytelling really is
Then I'll tell you, Andy's never seen it.
is us sort of repeating something that we've seen again and again and reframing it in a new way. When we tell a story, we add our own perspective to it and it adapts and changes, but there's a through line. So much of the history of American entertainment has really featured the cowboy, the lonesome hero, the hero's journey. And a lot of it's ridiculous, but a lot of it also has parallels to what's happening in the real world, in the politics of the West and in the history of like this country specifically. And so I just sort of reenacted the pastiche of that lonesome hero in this performance collage with other snippets of media from film and television. So it was a whole ordeal and quite complicated. And I had graduate student brain at that time, was overthinking a lot of things, but I see that project also now with a lot of clarity because I'm so fascinated by why we tell stories and how we tell stories. And I'm less interested in creating a new story, writing a new narrative, and instead looking at the narratives that we're already telling and retelling and trying to understand ourselves and my neighbors and our shared culture through the ways that we tell and perceive those stories. So let's see here. Keeping in the realm of the kind of interplay between the serious and the not so serious, this is another project from 2017 called Coyote. It's one of the few videos that I've made that really stands alone in a single screen because I tend to make a lot of installations. Here's a little snippet trailer.
So I'm going to explain about art now. I'm going to explain my sense of what trickster art is. In a way, to be an artist is to be a joint worker who makes things by jointing them, putting them together.
I think telling the trickster stories has this function.
The cosmos cannot exist without certain very clear divisions. And so theft is a way of having commerce without having commerce. It's a way of having connection without having connection.
So the video is 10 minutes long, and it's a little essay about Coyote, the Coyote from Trickster Myths, but also Wile E. Coyote from Looney Tunes, who I kind of identify with. And so Lewis Hyde is the first person you heard speaking there, and he says that Coyote is a genius and a fool, a destroyer, and the creator of the world. And I think that in many ways they're like artists. And then Wile E. Coyote, the cartoon, is a kind of ridiculous colonizer version of these mythic tricksters. And so I recognize, like, in the repetition of stories, there's a lot of thieving that goes on. And appropriation is a subject that's has many, many examples in contemporary art practice, painting and photography and video, et cetera. And so I do a lot of appropriation in my work as a means of like referencing the history of the stories and the way they're told, and that there's really nothing new on earth. And I'm aware that my time is running short, so I'll just bring you to a current project that's in progress right now. It's called Finches, and this project is anchored in Atticus Finch, who is a prominent character in To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, one of Alabama's most famous figures. And Atticus Finch is, well, I'll just let my interviewees tell you.
A man of conservative family values but liberal views of mankind, practiced law in Macomb, and served in the Alabama legislature for many years. He was known in the State House for his attention to detail, valued for his reason, diplomacy, and unwavering decency.
I mean, he represents, such
strong character traits. He had scruples, morals, and ethics that he lived by. The character was good,
understanding,
leadership, respect, and noble,
compassionate,
personal courage, and a realist.
That's a brief snippet of a project that right now is about 20 minutes long and is evolving to be a 4-channel 360-degree projection with a sculpture in the center. I'm making with a group of collaborators, not just me. But those interviewees were all people who are involved with the novel in some way. Many of them actually play the play in Monroeville, where the novel is set. And they're describing the character as presented in the novel. And we actually understand through more of Harper Lee's writing that the character is far more complicated than that. And so as we work with our community members to interpret this story that is told and retold in the state of Alabama and in the country, we're starting to see some of the preferences we have for the way we like to retell that story and for what parts of the story we like to press aside and ignore, we collectively as a culture. And so asking myself and our neighbors to retell and re-examine the stories that we hold on to so dearly that help inform our own self-identity and our own cultural identities is a way that I can sort of interact with my community in a way that's really deeply meaningful and sort of understand where we are as a community and as a nation and kind of unpack some things that lie under the surface of all of these stories. So I hope I didn't go too long there. Thank you again. And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And I'm going to pass it over to Charlie.
Hi, hope you can hear everyone. You can hear me well. So in thinking about what to sort of present today, it took me a while to, I wasn't really sure what it is I wanted to present. I'm not a filmmaker, so I'm not really talking about my own sort of filmmaking practice. And I just finished my doctoral thesis a couple of months ago, so there's also a certain part of me that doesn't necessarily want to continue talking about my doctoral thesis. It's finished and done, and I'm happy about that. But I think, Michael, you said when you invited me, and thank you for inviting me, this idea of talking about something that you're passionate about or something that I guess is stuck in your mind to a certain extent. And so to a certain extent, I was thinking that at the moment, an idea, a problem to a certain extent that I've been thinking about, that I have a difficulty sort of teasing out to a full extent. I thought it might be a good idea to use this as as a way to perhaps try out this problem that I'm having and see whether you can help me tease it out, I guess, to a certain extent. And it's got to do with this question of the avant-garde, right? The idea of the avant-garde as a term, as a concept, as a project, as a way that we think about art and time and our relationship with the world. And I think, there are sort of two contexts to my questioning of this idea of the avant-garde. One is that, so, as I said in my introduction, a lot of my research is on contemporary experimental photochemical film, and therefore, I've written a lot about and researched a lot about these sort of artist-run film labs that have popped up sort of all around the world in the last 30 years. And so invariably, obviously, the question of obsolescence and the idea of, to a certain extent, what at least on the surface seems sort of contradictory. That is the idea of using what is apparently, at least industrially, deemed to be an outdated, nostalgic medium to make avant-garde creations is something that there's a tension there that is interesting to me. And that, and I've talked about this before in an article that I wrote, and it'll come out soon. Is I had an experience once where I was invited to present a film by an anarchist collective in France called Les Scooters, who I'll sort of talk about the context of them a little bit later, but basically they make film collectively about political opposition spaces, but they also make it on film, and they develop everything themselves, and they make their own labs and that kind of thing. And so I went to this high school and I showed them this film, which I thought was, which I find beautiful and amazing and interesting and political and everything, and they absolutely hated it, and all told me, and and some of the students there who weren't necessarily particularly politically engaged, perhaps, one of their, but at least one of their criticisms was, why are they filming on film if they're going to make a political statement? Why does it look old, basically, to a certain extent? Right. So there's that sort of one context of the question, but more generally, the political context in France, if not perhaps the whole world these days, but at least at the moment in France, I don't know how much French news filters into the States, but I don't know if, as you may know, the last few months have been very much filled with protests, clashes with police, strikes, which I've participated in, against specifically sort of the proposed reforms to retirement laws, and specifically against the proposed changing of the retirement age, but more broadly and more importantly against a whole host of neoliberal policies brought in and proposed and sort of forced in by Macron, who's the president, who's trying and more or less succeeding with brute force to drag France into a sort of a neoliberal, or at least more obviously neoliberal political system, right? And tellingly has repeatedly used language when trying to how would you say, explain why these reforms are happening, language that's suspiciously close to Thatcher's famous "there is no alternative," right? And, more generally than that, in terms of the history of political sort of contestation in France in the last 20, 30 years, some of the more radical political projects or movements or spaces even in France have been what are called ZAD, Z-A-D, Z-A-D, so Zone à défendre, like zones to defend. That is these more or less autonomous spaces, quite large spaces, often in the countryside, that have sprung up where people come and live and fight with police and learn to live differently and create political projects, but always as a way to defend this space against the building of an airport, or so that was in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, or the most recent one at the moment is in a place called Bure, B-U-R-E, where they're protesting against the creation of a nuclear waste containment site. And basically, I talk about this because it comes to something quite similar, at least obliquely, in the idea of using photochemical film when it's supposed to be obsolete, and the more radical political projects or spaces in France being called zones to defend, is this idea that perhaps the political or the creative, at least one of the creative and political sites of contestation or of what would have been called the avant-garde, is no longer about creating for, it's no longer about inserting the future into the present as it has been defined sort of classically by a bunch of people, Jarek and Osborne and Benjamin and that kind of thing, but about defending something that needs to be defended against hegemony, against industry, against neoliberalism, against political violence. So that sort of brings me in both terms to think about this idea that I have difficulty sort of teasing out, which is that does the avant-garde, do we need to abandon the idea, or the term at least, of an avant-garde? If the idea of an avant-garde, at least classically, was the idea of the first soldiers going out to battle and being the first to see the future, and then opening up that space for the rest of society to follow. To a certain extent, as has been written about by a bunch of people, I'm not the first person to talk about this, but to a certain extent, that very idea of the future, inserting the future into the present, or making new spaces for the future the future that we want to happen, has been co-opted by, you listen to the language of people like Macron, they talk in those terms, right? They talk about making space for the future. They talk about innovation. They talk about creating new forms for the milieu of tomorrow and that kind of thing. And so, the question that I've had and that I have difficulty sort of getting to the end of is, as we get into this, as we live in these societies where the question is perhaps less urgently what to do about how do we create new forms for futures, but rather, a more urgent problem of how do we keep the ground from eroding beneath our very feet? How do we fight then? How do we create? How do we oppose? That is, how do we perhaps put aside questions of utopia or avant-garde and create or fight or engage politically in new ways? And what does that look like in terms of cinema? And I think the danger of that, and things that I've heard people talk about, even talking about the protests that's happening in France, or even the left wing in France. And the problem with the left wing is it comes up a lot, this criticism of the only thing we're doing is defending, right? We don't have time to propose new things. But perhaps that's asking the question in the wrong way. Whether it be through art making or political engagement, is rather, perhaps the question needs to be, how do we create in a way, or how do we fight in a way that doesn't think of time as linear, that doesn't force us to think in terms of, well, we need to be innovative so that we can make new spaces and move and progress and that kind of things. And that's not just about saying we need to look to the past or preserve traditions, but maybe exactly shake up a linear way of thinking about time itself. But then what does that look like in filmmaking? What does that look like in art making? And it's interesting, I think it's interesting to be on a panel with the two people, with Melissa and Fernando, who just spoke. And I think there are, interestingly, some sort of answers to some of the questions I'm asking, or at least tentative possibilities. So it's coincidence or not. Maybe I think you're a very good chooser of people to come together. I think that's sort of the question that I've been asking myself a lot, and just and I think I've gone over a little bit, but there's an idea, there's a metaphor that has been rattling around in my head ever since I sort of read it, which is a metaphor proposed by a French philosopher called Michel Serres, Serres, who in the 90s was talking with Bruno Latour in a book called, I think, Conversations in English. And Bruno Latour was kind of talking to him about how, he's sort of accusing him of writing about time in a way that no one understands. And Michel Serres said, you got to think about it in this way. We all capitalism has a tendency to think about time as a flat handkerchief with geometric spaces where we know that here and here are always going to be this far away from each other. And then he said, instead of that, we've got to think about taking that handkerchief, crumpling it up and putting it in our pocket. And that's time. That different things overlap and touch, and different places that should be distant touch each other and re-emerge as being pertinent. And things that should be close are in fact further away than they used to be, and that kind of thing. And I think to a certain extent there's there's an answer somewhere, or at least at the beginning of an answer to my problem at the moment in that metaphor. But I have difficulty teasing it out entirely. So perhaps, hopefully, we can do a little bit more here.
Oh my God. So we we have another like Clockwork episode, it looks like. It's never gotten to this part of the episode, and I'm like, man, I have no idea what we're gonna talk about now. If anything, though, there's just too much. And I will do my best at this point to sort of wrap up and to find these similarities as we're going through. And it's actually interesting because, I mean, I'm constantly thinking about the avant-garde from this perspective as well. And so in my response too, I might lean a little heavier on the response having to do with the avant-garde, but I do want to speak about how that actually directly ties to these moments of intimacy, for instance, that we began with what Fernando was talking about. I think about also, and I've brought this up before, I've also brought up Devani from Los Ingravidos before a number of times, because what you've been talking about is that place that Los Ingravidos, for instance, finds in their work. And you say, for instance, it comes out of lived experience, Fernando, and I have to fully agree with you. I think that there's a particular way in which a type of expression will only be able to come out of you if you have already gone that path to create it. Now, there's plenty of people who can get fooled by the work that people put up on screen. There's a lot of ways in which I think that even the notion of, or the popularity of autoethnography and of ethnographic documentary within experimental film in particular, but I mean, in just all of documentary practices, has become an extraordinarily fraught place where no matter how much academia is involved and no matter how many explanations are involved, one can kind of tell when somebody is using a particular form for its success as opposed to its true value, or as opposed to, let's say, as a container for expression of something of significance. And I mean to say that, yes, that within the arts, there's always this notion of finding not only the thing that allows you to express as clearly as you'd like that whatever that inner knot is that's inside of you that forces this action, but rather that there's this other aspect which is driven by a success. That success is driven by popularity and money, and oftentimes it's rooted in that same form of nothingness. And so the use of autoethnographic and of just ethnographic documentary methods has, I think, especially within that period of 10 years, been turned into the theme of film festivals, the popularized variations of what will be accepted by an institutional platform, for instance. And oftentimes that's because the act of making a documentary is oftentimes seen as not as, say, upsetting or maybe as directly critique of a system of power than, for instance, something that might in fact use the now considered say problematic forms of narrative representation, for instance, or to even think of the media itself as a whole as a sort of drug, and that it has no authenticity. Yeah, I do think that there is a really deep part of me that believes in this form of intimacy that Fernando is talking about. And that actually brings me in some ways to the 16 millimeter. The 16 millimeters we're talking about is a form of nostalgia, is a form of the obsolete. And yet at the same time, and I think this is kind of what we get from Los Ingravidos or from some experimental filmmakers, they also recognize that it is a tool by which to record multiple instances and perspectives of a recorded volume of space onto and imprinted upon the same physical ground. And so, in particular, Los Ingravidos' use of multiple exposure and the direct confrontation with the actual technology, its quote proper use as representation, and then it's in finding what they call the shamanic use of its representation, or finding that point at which now the relation that one has towards the film itself as a medium is actually it's almost sublimated, that you go on a journey, let's say, and you give up some level of control and allow for the way that the light plays out, as well as whatever knowledge you might have of the photographic or photochemical method, to play on the surface of a existing object so as to give you a record of what it is to see things from shifting and malleable perspectives that are more akin, let's say, to our memory than are the still sequences of a digital timeline, or let's say a film strip that has been run through a camera for a single exposure. And then, of course, all of the physical interventions as well. I was lucky to see a Saul Levine movie in Ann Arbor Film Festival, which is of course Super 8, and as Saul Levine's movies normally are, constantly editing, like constantly back and forth with huge chunks of the film glue on there, and you realize that it's not so much the things that are expressed, though they are of course from a very political nature as well. But what Saul's work and what Los Ingravidos, and I think my work also have in context, is in this place that the image goes to expand and contract within the space of a frame, within let's say the experience of the light and the suspension of the theater itself. Okay, and now I've gone off on that tangent, but only to come back really, which is to say that now we have the added issue of the avant-garde and what that kind of means. Melissa's talking a lot also about like the usage of the sample, essentially the archive. The story is one way of recycling a sample of sorts, the sample of a structure, let's say. But then there's also the usage of, for instance, Wile E. Coyote and the Merry Melodies, and of all of the different texts that one can now put together, for instance, in such an easy way in digital means, blending the analog and the digital into a purely mulched hybridity, right? And yet that I think is at the heart of another avant-garde practice, which is hip hop. So my feelings on the avant-garde, to sum up this particular thread, and there's so much to talk about here, but my feelings on the avant-garde are expressed in three ways, I'll say. I was a student of a theorist named Boris Groys, who at one point spoke or taught a seminar at New York University. And Boris is a really interesting guy. He's like all over the place. We used to have tons of conversations after class, but sometimes class would just be me and Boris going, and then the rest of the class would just be like, are you guys really fucking talking about this again? So Boris made really good points about the avant-garde. That was the topic of the class. One of them being that the avant-garde is oftentimes viewed in a manner of like of this constantly clearing new space, but potentially the avant-garde is actually just always just against something, and that's like one critical key point of the avant-garde. To put the futurists, for instance, together with the situationists, I mean, it is the in some ways the antithesis of one another, but in other ways they have a very similar militant fixation upon the way in which the potentially the body itself is of no concern past the concerns of the principles that one espouses. Of course, in the futurists model, it is that the body itself should be wasted in the glorious industrial hell of the car crash or whatever it might be. Um, while in the form of the situationist, at least the form of Guy Debord, it's that deep despair at the all encompassing spectacle. It seems to be of no use, but we have to attempt to use the tools of negation against itself, using negation and using the negation of the negation as a property for some sort of alchemical change in a political manner. I think the avant-garde, though, is also really best expressed with hip hop, because hip hop is literally using the means by which distribution of the most popular entertainment is disseminated, and using it for multisyllabic rhyming with multiple levels of meaning, introducing, in the case of Wu-Tang, of course, introducing different lexicons to a mainstream, and also of using the sample, very much so, taking the sample and regenerating the sample in a musical form, but also in a form that, like, nerds like myself, big hip hop heads, would go back to fully to reread and reread. I don't think that there's much different in that than in the practice of, say, like Harney, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, in the sense that they're creating dense texts that force that rereading. Okay, and then I'll end with this. We wrote for this. There's a group that I'm a part of, co-founded, called Agitate. Agitate has no rules, essentially, and so I wrote about the avant-garde. I said this avant-garde needn't believe anything in any manifesto, and it will still be valid. This manifesto needn't be considered, and the avant-garde will still be valid. I said, avant-garde, front line, front forging ahead, front falling on the sword, front killing the enemy, front getting the bullets, front first in the offensive, first to defend, first to destroy, and first to be savagely destroyed, for the very impetus to exist and to express and to hold value strong enough to end this time space and the false reality that's been projected on its contours, first to allow itself to be fluid, to operate in fluid forms, to take shrapnel and let the body become fluid, to express gender fluidly, to become fluid, to match the ever-changing contours of the alpha digital model it reacts against. And so with that, thank you. I will pass it off to y'all.
You just like synthesize so much of the issue with it in terms of the avant-garde. I was like, the idea of using 16, just kept like rolling in my head, because I mean, we've mentioned like Los Ingrávidos this whole time, and a big part of their body of work is the 16. And I think, I think it's like, I think 16 lends itself very well to the manipulation and the distortion and the destruction of an image, which the image in the context of film is the reality, in the same way that the system, is treating the reality of the people, affected in these portraits, that Los Ingrávidos made. So I think it makes in that case, for example, thinking of like the vanguards, the avant-garde, and responding to reality, it makes a lot of sense, to like use this type of materials, which I think at this point, because they exist, it's not like you have to travel in time to get 16 millimeter. You can get it. It might be harder than before, but you can. So there's a parallel with the digital, at least in terms of like, there's the option. I think there's in the same sense that like in documentary or like in any like film tradition, like different genres have developed. At some point, like perhaps the essay film or the autoethnography was considered an evolution from like the observational, but I think at this point there have been like developments at the level of the process, the making, that have made all these styles like parallel to each other in a way. And I think the 16 millimeter format finds itself in the world of film at that level, like as a parallel option, just because of because of the system. Like, it's just harder to get because it's not like commercially as viable. But still, as a tool, I remember a prof in undergrad said like, oh, people ask why you 16, but they don't question a painter that chooses between oil, or like charcoal, or and those are tools that, at some point perhaps were considered an evolution, or a different current. But I think we live in a time where you can consider these tools as like options. And again, in the context of Los Ingravios, and when you have to portray a reality that is in context, like constant manipulation, 16 makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't know.
Real quick, because and not to take more space, but rather that this actually goes to two really important things with 16 millimeter format that I think that are worth going into just a little bit. One is that the 16 millimeter format, let's say for me, I've had a Bolex for years because I bought one on Craigslist for $250. The guy was like, nobody's used it, and I just want somebody to make good use of it. And before that, I had a Bolex that was broken by somebody who was shady. So my used 16 millimeter cameras had gotten me by basically for multiple feature films. The other thing I'd argue though is also we're maybe in a shakier ground than folks think when it comes to like the use of the analog versus the digital too, because I would say digital cinema is a more costly, more precious medium, hard drive space included, camera included, lens types, etc., than say this Bolex where I have a lens on it that's another used C-mount lens. It was at one point a far more consumer grade thing, but for the bourgeois, of course. But actually the 16 millimeter system, while it is also, like, as you said, a system by which you can tangle the image, you can deface the image, you can manipulate it, it's also actually the means by which I can get one of the crispest, one of like the most beautiful images, right? The image that doesn't come associated with the video camcorder, which is kind of like I think a lot of folks, especially in our generations, started making movies having to try to warp the sense of what was filmic cinematic in a theater with this like standard definition or less than standard definition tape-based medium that was like kind of halfway between the analog and the digital. And so for me, 16 millimeters digitized form is kind of like the high-end version of that. It's another hybrid media. And I actually maybe take even less concern over whether something projects at 16 millimeter or projects analog. And I know that there are definitely, let's say, aesthetic considerations that one can make at that point. But for me, the usage of 16 millimeter is in the capturing. So, and that's my own practice, though.
I mean, just to continue on that idea, I mean, it's interesting to see the different, and that sort of links back to kind of what I was trying to say is also this idea of how do we talk about this without it becoming just a nostalgic aesthetic, right? And on the other hand, there's the purists of the showing film just on film and hating digital and doing nothing with digital and never even touching anything on digital and getting a little intense about the very possibility that something might touch digital and that kind of thing, which is a position to have, I guess, but it's a position that also limits the possibilities of showing your films to everyone or to anyone, and making them into these very rarefied sort of, I don't know, church spaces to a certain extent, where all of a sudden we can show that. But and I think at the same time it comes back to, without having to segregate as much, and being able to say that there is these hybrid, that there is something interesting about, you were saying, Fernando, about this idea that no one asks a charcoal drawer why he uses charcoal. It is funny that with this, it's the one medium, and I think Peter Tchaikovsky said this somewhere as well, of, it's the first time in the history of art that we've gone, no, you're not allowed to use that anymore. The industry has decided that, you can use it, but it's always going to be more and more difficult. We're not going to be able to project it. In France, when they moved from film projection to digital projection, not only did they replace the film projectors with digital projectors, they destroyed the film projectors so that no one would ever be able to use them, which is an insane sort of, people have told me about it, how they were sort of running to try and get them so they could get them for their film labs, and they'd arrive and this guy with a sledgehammer was destroying a film, this sort of insane violent scenes of a guy, for some reason, these cinemas deciding that if they can't use them, then no one can have it. And there's, I think, as you were saying, this idea of the avant-garde, perhaps, and I find that an interesting idea, that the avant-garde is just about being against something, or at least is always about being against something. In that way, there is something interesting about the idea that the industry has decided that the hegemonic image is going to be the digital image, and there are possibilities for to use film in a specific kind of way, and otherwise it's seen as nostalgic, or otherwise it's seen as an affectation to a certain extent, whereas there's a bunch of possibilities of film. And then that comes back to the idea of, at the very least, the idea of intimacy with a physical medium is something that comes up all the time when you talk to experimental filmmakers who work with the surface and that kind of thing. Is this idea of they have nothing against digital so much as rather that just their practice is about being intimate with a physical thing that they've got in front of them, that they can manipulate, that they can touch, that they can leave their traces on, and that kind of thing.
Listening to you all it's so fascinating to think about the avant-garde anew. It's almost something that I haven't let myself think about for a while. And it's in this conversation, a fresh question for me. And I'm sitting here with this hypothesis that maybe the avant-garde is just always a shaking off of an externally imposed structure. And then in that way, like the analog purist film is avant-garde against the mass distribution of the poor image, whereas the absolute the meme is the resistance against the aura of the precious singular object. And these things are direct opposites, but in the same way they're of the same spirit. That there's this value, there's a structure that implies a value system, and I want to challenge that value system. And to me, that makes sense why it feels so lateral now.
In fact, this is very interesting. I mean, like they were talking, I was just working with the Chicago Latino Film Festival, and of course, there's a Cuban film, and we're talking about how the tools of production in Cuba, the 35 millimeter film production, was used for so long and continued to be used for so long, that the way in which that the nostalgic, say, film folks here potentially, or in areas around the world where they did not have the same say, level of embargo or containment of a forced containment of a society, that those places that had made the digital changeover, right, we don't view it in the same way as they do. We almost view it as like this delicacy of the past, as opposed to as them understanding like the practical realities of how to produce a work. And it's interesting in that manner too. And it's also interesting in that what is not happening is really, I mean, yes, it's Super 8 until somebody figures out that Super 8 is actually pragmatically much more difficult to get scanned, to get turned into a product that you could use digitally if you wanted to. But the 16 millimeter, on the other hand, just happens to be at a perfect like, kind of nexus where people are still using it. The technology to make the film has improved to the point where one could maybe argue that it has some of like the quality of an early 35 millimeter or some antiquated old 35 millimeter stocks. And so it's obviously the extraordinarily rich, those who have quite a good amount of budget, will go 35 millimeter, and especially in experimental film, that's when they're seen as, oh wow, look at 35. Oh my God, they're doing IMAX. And it's funny because it's also such a culture tradition or whatever, rooted in so much like talk of anti-capitalism, but it really is also like very much nurturing this very objectifying material way of viewing it and work, which is why I'm interested in that place where they converge. And I'm also interested in using film as a substance that just has like a different effect. Like you were talking about the use of, say, oil and charcoal or acrylic, etc. But I think of it as more like it's the difference of like how much chemical do you mix so that somebody gets a dissociative experience or a stimulant experience or whatever it might be. And when it comes to the use of this term avant-garde, it's like, yeah, I think on like the most positive sense, I wish it were an avant-garde, but like potentially really all we're doing is mixing certain kinds of drugs.
I'm stealing that.
I think, yeah, we are mixing drugs, with chemistry, if using film physics, I guess. I think that the Cuban example is so interesting because, I mean, it's the reflect, of course, of an economic reality, and it just makes sense. Like film has that curse of being like a child of the Industrial Revolution. So I think that the discussion of the avant-garde in that sense is like has to consider the idea that okay, like you can complain that someone is not using the digital, but the digital responds to like industrial needs, and that that history of destroying the projectors is very much how like cell phones or computers get obsolete, and like the industry makes sure that they become obsolete, useless, because you need to advance. And perhaps going back has the potential, to make a statement in that sense. I guess, and yeah, going back. But then, of course, like, because they're products, there's that of objectification too, of like, oh, I can do 35. And again, it goes back to that same logic, I think, yeah, and I think that's why I think that perhaps the avant-garde or the innovations need perhaps like go more on like a theoretical sense. They can happen once you can accept this, like this curse in a way, or this history, and you can perhaps understand, okay, these are the tools that are given and the tools of the system, and one is immersed in the system, and one cannot talk of the history of cinema without talking about the history of the system. How from a theoretical sense one can reappropriate these tools, and how one can like perhaps evade this, this process of whatever the industry wants is what's going to happen. I think, I don't know. I think that's like an important consideration. And yeah, I don't know, it's just that because sometimes I always question, like, oh, should I try 16? Should I, like, I think it, like you said, like it's an example of a level of intimacy that is not, it does not come from the film being about you, but, but coming from you, in the sense that you're trying to translate what matters to you in an aesthetic way. And I think it's a very beautiful aesthetic to, but then in terms of my process, it doesn't make sense for me, you know? So, so I think it's, yeah, the idea of like thinking of them as tools and reappropriating them and like treating them according to your context, like the Cubans to like 35. I don't know. It's, yeah.
I think you're often, not you, but like general, are often punished when you make aesthetic considerations that do not concern or do not take into account the function of the process of the work that you're doing. And I think that that actually is a major issue because people see that with very little effort, they can take a nostalgic media and take a particular type of style to apply it simply by applying a medium to something. And I think that that's unfortunately a grounds by which many people enter into experimental filmmaking or enter into filmmaking in general, with very specific style based things they want to animate, or to reincarnate in some way, so as to make themselves the creators of an experience that's very much like a drug experience that they had previously been inhabiting, let's say.
I'm trying to say you think you're saying that people have a tendency to try and emulate, or like the problem perhaps is that instead of thinking in terms of process, they're thinking in terms of the final product that they think should look like this, should emulate a drug, or a drug experience, or an aesthetic experience, and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's an interesting. It's an interesting idea, because it's true that I'm going to lose the idea that I had in my head, but I think it makes me think of, you're thinking of drug experiences and that kind of thing, and or like, as film as being a drug experience, and again, it's when you talk about process and the experience of making films as well, that's a thing that I've been trying to think of these days as well, is that perhaps we talk a lot about the experience of seeing films, right? Or we talk about the political function of a film in terms of what it produces for spectators, or what it creates, that, or what sort of actions it creates in the spectators afterwards. And that perhaps one of the questions in terms of political function of films is rather, what kind of actions are filmmakers making? What is the drug trip of actually making a film, for example, or that kind of thing? Or what is the experience of making a film, or making any kind of artwork? And I've been writing a fair bit on eco-criticism and that kind of thing, and I think more and more that becomes the question, is rather not, or at least letting the second question of how does that translate to spectators, letting that aside for a second and being like, well, what kind of experiences do we want first from making the film? What does that create in itself, and that kind of thing? What processes are generated? Can there be new processes? Can we re-envisage older processes and recontextualize them, and that kind of thing? Again, in relationship with the ground with which we that we're trying to defend, and that kind of thing. And I think that's part of the reason that I got interested in process film and that kind of thing already, is that it's at least almost more important the process of making the film than the actual film itself to a certain extent.
Yeah, we rub up against this in visual art a lot. Social practice has become really prominent increasingly in the past number of decades, and it's really a valid form of practice and I think really admirable. And I recognize that some of what I've been doing lately kind of falls into the category of social practice, which is a broad category. Um, so, in the best cases, the process of making the project is the project. Um, and that it's considered and contain the meaningfulness of the project is in the thoughtfulness of the production, and that it's taken as seriously as the end product, if there even is one. The risk of that, often we see in visual art, is that if we lean into just the feel good of the process, like, didn't that feel nice to have these great moments with people, that not having the end in sight can actually get us lost. And so, I mean, it's a struggle for any visual artist, the working with social practice, and certainly a struggle for me, is that I do believe that, like, the Finch's project that I'm working on right now, that these conversations we're having with people and encouraging reconsiderations of our heroes and how we grapple with having a love for someone or something that we see as being really flawed, like that's an important conversation to have. But if that's all we have to offer in the work, then, like, I don't know that that's enough. At the same time, if I make something that's has a really compelling end product that can be screened somewhere and people can walk away rubbing their beards, thinking deep thoughts, but if the process was, you know, inconsiderate or vapid, then it's an equal failure. And so it's a difficult balance to strike. I think we've mentioned, ethnographic and documentary process a few times in here, but um, it's hard. It's hard to know while you're making the thing whether or not it's going to end up being anything in the end. So that's a question that I have for people, for you coming from a film background, and I'm from this visual art background, is like, how do you grapple with that? Emphasizing the process versus the product or the final audience. And like, where does the project start for you? And how do you sort through those priorities in the process of making something?
Yeah, I think first, and I think that's why I keep going back to the idea of intimacy. I think that translate, and that doesn't mean that it's like intimacy doesn't mean that it's not necessarily about me. It's about my parents, or it's about. It means that you can, uh, like, people, basically, in simple words, people feel comfortable about it because they care. And I think when the person you are working with cares about it, like, they're on screen because they care and they have an interest in it, and they're concerned in their image, and their work, being shared. Um, I think that translates, and I think that's a very important part of the process, just making sure that your work, and I think it's super simple, but I think it's something that one needs to keep in mind, that you, and I think that's where the intimate becomes true, because they're speaking from themselves. They're not just speaking about themselves. And I'm not just like portraying like something, making a film that's about something, but it's a film that in the end, like, and I go back again to the idea of the lived experience, it's like through people's words and actions on screen, you get this sense of what they want to say. I think, yeah, in terms of process, in terms of like an ethnographic, model, to me, that should be the basis, like the minimum starting point that the people that are being portrayed care about it, which is not often the case. And I think you can see that, and that's where when you were saying that trap of autoethnography, I think it's usually related to that, which is also related to that trap of trying to emulate aesthetics, It's just it needs to look this way. So I'm gonna do the things I think, aesthetically, and like moving the camera can get me to that point. But it's actually, it needs to start like asking, like, do you want to tell the story? In which terms? In what terms do you want to tell that story? And finding, that the connecting point. And I think, yeah, I don't know. At least that's the way that for me has worked, and I think has like allowed me, to make these portraits that I consider intimate, that I refer to as intimate, whether they're like collaborations with my dad or with people here in Chicago that that I had just met. Yeah, I don't know. That's I.
So there's so much good there. I think that actually there's like this grounds where this exploration happens on this good faith on one level, that what you're describing is the quote, it's not simple, but is the approach of meeting the project at good faith. And then I think that my my process goes quite the opposite direction, but that's also, I think, within the same boundaries. It's like a kind of a character foil to my process, is what you're describing, Fernando, which is to say, my process has recently actually included a far more like an intimate portraits of my grandparents, for instance. I've just worked on the first film I've ever made with my daughter. We're in the process now. We're working on that, and it's also showing the blemishes of it, showing the recording, and trying to undo at every point. Something that I learned from Lynn Sachs. Really, Lynn was a teacher of mine, and Lynn's process, especially when it comes down to documentary, does always have to do with like am I creating this moment of diegetic space? Am I creating this illusional space? Break it. When I break it, it creates another illusional space. Break that, break it, and it goes through this. But it's still magical. It's celebratory. It's not nihilistic in that sense. My biggest fear is of this nothing. My biggest fear is nothing, because I think that I've known people who would rather that the background, the backing of their existence be nothing, so that they don't have to take on any ethical considerations, and then they can go by the process of perpetuating that nothing. Now that's where a lack of significance, or potentially not a lack of focus on the process of making a work, could actually unconsciously generate other forms of nothingness that take up space, that take up time, that take up that cause false representations, etc. However, I think my own practice began because I was a drug addict as a high schooler, always, but as a user, as a high schooler, attempting to figure out from that point the bad faith efforts to take what I had inside and to reflect it on the outside, and recognizing that filmmaking isn't that, but that there is some sort of alchemical medium, however, that gets close to it and is almost horrifying. That thing exists. So maybe my work is a conspiracy theory, because all movies are conspiracy theories, because reality is a conspiracy theory, essentially. And so from the standpoint of the conspiracy theory, you have to believe in something that you know truly to be at the heart of that conspiracy or that theory, whatever it might be. And despite knowing, let's say, practical realities of the situation, that thing has to be so moving that it still beguiles you. It still takes you on to maddening or creative madness, this journey of creative madness through whatever medium you're approached with. And so I handle it as like, I've been making the same work of art since I was 16 years old, and I'm 34. And maybe one day it'll be done. But durational practice in that way makes it so that even this conversation is just like, to be honest, an extension, a tangent in my own practice too. I do have a question for you, Melissa, though. It's about narrative or story. And I wanted to ask you more about that, where you find the limitations of story and why story is of importance still.
Well, story is the way that people actually like grab hold of an idea. You know, I'm trying to decide what direction to go in and answer your question right now. There's a part of me that wants to talk about like contemporary political dialogue, and I think I'm not going to go there. But I think we can see how powerful story is when it's employed for polemical ends. Um, I think stories provide a through line, um, for us and our pasts and our ancestors, but also for us to relate to other people that we interact with. If there's a shared story or a shared type of story that multiple people can identify with, and like, okay, we have some sort of understanding here, um, whether that's deep or shallow. Here in Alabama, do you root for Alabama or do you root for Auburn? That's a story of your own past and your own cultural identity that can be summed up in a sentence. And that's a really trivial example, but stories are shorthand for our identity, and they're shorthand for like what groups and ideologies we like to associate ourselves with. And so, the story of the Western movie it's a story about, what we think it is uh, to be an American. It's a story of what we think it is to be a hero. Um, the story of In To Kill a Mockingbird is the story of, honestly, I'm sorry to all the people who I know and care about in Monroeville, Alabama, but when I saw that play performed live there, it seemed to me like a story that an imaginary story of white absolution of racism. Like Atticus Finch cared about Tom Robinson and stood up for him, and therefore pat ourselves on the back. We did a good job. Well, Tom Robinson got murdered in the end, and so stories are a way for us to identify with the best aspects of ourselves, or the things that we hope to be the best aspects of ourselves, and to edit out. Stories are edits. They're edited. It's just like making a documentary film. I feel like I'm kind of going all over the place here, but making ethnographic processes or editing a sentence, you're removing things. And that's what stories do. You tell from one perspective, you edit and curate and remove from a vast sea of opportunities of information and feelings and perspectives. You edit it down into this one thing. So if we share a story with somebody, it's a really nice shorthand. And so I'm really interested in that. I like to hear other people's stories because it helps me understand the culture I live in, and understand myself. I need to pick apart the stories that I like to tell myself. And it's also this sort of like therapist chair thing. Like, the story you tell yourself, like how can we rewrite the story that we tell about ourselves? I think that therapist perspective on like self-improvement or self-awareness is something we can apply more broadly to our culture. And so that's why I'm more interested in just like recognizing what stories are being told than like coming up with new stories. It's like maybe I should have been a therapist.
I love that. I think that there's so much fraught in story, and yet at the same time, there's also the anti-story, anti-narrative dogma that is particular to experimental film, and it actually negates so much. Though it's not simply negating the negations or the edits like you're talking about, but it is actually negating large amounts of cultural society or microcosm identities, diasporas, and the way that different people think and organize their experiences. And yet at the same time, of course, that the story is fraught. Like that's also the vehicle, as we're talking about, that seems to most potently um, dig into the psyche. Although maybe the academic form of that is just the ethnographic documentary. Like once you get to a certain academic form, sure, like the fictional story doesn't work as potently as a drug, but you'll go and believe what you need to from a film experience or from an art experience, particularly if it has been given the clout, the academic backing.
Well, Michael, there's a parallel to this in the history of sculpture. Like minimalist sculpture is the sort of parallel to this. Like, oh, we're stripping it of all of the decoration and story and significance. Um, and in itself, like that is a story and that is a new type of significance. You know what I mean?
We're entering our last 3 minutes, so that means everyone gets a final word. I am going to start with actually whoever wants to go to have a final word. It could be whatever you want to say. Uh, go ahead.
I guess I'll go first. It's interesting the different sort of. It's a fascinating experience, this kind of podcast, because we've gone through different things and had keywords that have sort of kept popping up of drugs and intimacy and the avant-garde, and that's great keywords to sort of latch on to. But yeah, no, it's been really interesting, and the last thing you just said about sculpt, the stripping down of sculpture being a story as well, and it just made me think of discussions I've had with my students about students who are often very reluctant, at least at first, to even think that they could possibly enjoy experimental cinema, and often that's to a certain extent what I say as well, is that there is always a story there, even though it's not necessarily apparent. That the grain of the film in this abstract 2-minute flashing light film is also telling a story of some sort, and that has to do with, again, the avant-garde, drugs, and intimacy. So.
Yeah, I think life is good, if it has like the right amount of avant-garde, drugs, and intimacy. I think those are good keywords, to live with. Yeah, and I think the sculpture example, like connecting it to the ethnographic model or ethnographic mode, I do think though that again that it goes back to the idea of like thinking of certain modes and genres as evolution from others. I think at this point it's rare to find an ethnographic film that claims to portray the absolute truth, as you could have said, about other films in the past. I consider myself an ethnographic documentary filmmaker in a way, concerned with the process. And at this point in my making, trying to be truthful to this process that's, behind the final film. And I think I'm going to do a plug. An example of this is my thesis film, Brief Space of a Time. An intimate portrait of, the life of my aunt and uncle, an indigenous Mapuche couple living in the south of Chile in a project of land reclamation. It's very focused on daily life and it's showing on May 10 at 8:30 in the Jean Cisco Film Center. So if you have a chance, check it out. But yeah.
I guess that leaves me. Congratulations, Fernando. I know that's a big milestone. And I'm going to look all of you up next time I'm in Chicago. Yeah, I think so much of this is just about like bearing witness, intimacy, drugs, avant-garde stories. Yeah, I think there's like being present in our living bodies and bearing witness to those who are also in these living bodies trying to figure it all out. It has been my experience of this podcast and my experience as an artist, and I'm just grateful to be part of it.
Oh, what a beautiful conversation. Thank you all for joining. And we're right on time too. So this is actually a rarity here at Like Clockwork. I will also extra plug Fernando's movie, May 10th, you said? Gene Siskel Film Center. And of course, we will put that on our social media. I love this conversation. I hope we have it again. But as all of our episodes end, it's going to be abrupt. And I just kind of say, bye.